The 2019-2020 fires, what did we learn and how will it equip us for the future is the title of our next presentation with Professor Ross Bradstock from the University of Wollongong. Emeritus Professor Rod co-established the Centre for Environmental Risk Management of Bushfires at Wollongong University back in 2006. They're dedicated to the development of an understanding of risks posed by bushfires and how these risks can be mitigated through cost-effective management. Recently, he led the establishment of the New South Wales Bushfire Risk Management Research Hub, which is a collaboration between UOW, New South Wales Government, Western Sydney University, the University of New South Wales, and the University of Tasmania. He retired as Director of the Centre and the Research Hub in August. He has worked extensively with government agencies and the community to help improve our understanding and our capacity to coexist with fire. He served as an expert witness at 2 royal commissions and led a major technical project that supported the New South Wales Independent Bushfire Inquiry during 2020. Ross lives up in the Blue Mountains region, so he tells me during COVID last year he was lucky enough that he wasn't particularly cooped up during the year, during lockdown. He actually spent a lot of that time getting out, walking and cycling, getting out to explore, in his words, his own giant backyard of the Blue Mountains, and he now appreciates more than ever what lies close to home. I can say that's something that many of us would have experienced. Having said that, he did say to me he's still looking forward to getting back on a plane whenever he can. He joins us this afternoon to discuss some learnings from the 2019 bushfire, 2019-20 bushfires. Please welcome Professor Ross Bradstock.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. It's a privilege to be able to make a presentation to this conference. It's also a privilege to give something live. I'm completely sick of Zoom, listening to people talking on Zoom, talking to myself on Zoom. I'm serious. It's really great to feel the vibe in an audience, etc. So that's wonderful. I'm obviously going to talk about the 2019-20 fire season. By necessity, I will present some of the work, just a quick overview of some of the work we did to support the New South Wales Bushfire Inquiry, some of the forensics. I've put in a few graphs, I've kept them simple, and I put them there as exhibits, and I will give you a very brief written summary of what they mean to assist interpretation. I'm going to end the talk by talking about Aboriginal people, so I won't acknowledge country at the beginning, but I will do it at the end. So thank you, and we'll move on. This was the pyroconvective phenomenon observed on the 5th of January at Kangaroo Valley. Extraordinary. And it's, one of the most powerful images I've seen, and it was actually taken by a work colleague who lived down there and soon afterwards experienced the full onslaught of that fire. The amount of energy in that smoke column is incredible. So it serves as a great introduction for us to think about what happened, to analyse some of the circumstances and causes of the extraordinary 2019-20 season. So I'm very briefly going to talk about what happened and its significance, some of the fire characteristics and their determinants, what we know, give a brief summation of who and what was affected and maybe why, what has changed in the aftermath, and what does the future hold as a consequence. It's fair to say we did a lot of technical work for the inquiry, but there's a continuing deluge, almost an avalanche of scientific material coming out about these fires. They are globally significant, and we're still still trawling through the entrails, and people will be doing this for a long time. There is so much we can find out which will help us in the future, hopefully. Okay, so there's a map of the fires. Roughly about 5 million hectares burnt across eastern New South Wales. Here's just a very simple chart which in blue shows the history in terms of area burned in seasons going back to about 1970. In blue, forest, areas of forest burned. So you can see from that chart the magnitude of 2019-20 as forest fires in eastern New South Wales compared to the last few decades. The grey bars simply represent the big fires in the Western Division, which are not forest fires, they're woodland or grassland fires, and many people may remember the tremendous 1974-5 season and also 84-85. I hope we're not going to be talking about 2021-22 in the Western New South Wales if we get more rain this winter. We know that forest fires in the east follow drought, whereas the fires in the dry country in the west tend to follow above average rain. So we have two different types of fuel systems and weather systems that drive these events. So 2019-20 is unprecedented in the historical record for New South Wales in terms of area burnt. You may not be able to read all the detail on this map. This publication only came out last week, but it shows major fire seasons across the world in the last 5 years. In Australia, southeastern Australia, we can see 5,800,000 hectares burned in the 1920 season. We can see some big events over in the western USA, particularly last year, where the area burned was about 2.5 million. But in terms of similar environments, what we call mid-latitude environments, the 2019 fires stand out head and shoulders above the rest. It's only when we go up into the boreal forests of Alaska, northern Canada and Siberia that you see much bigger fire seasons, but they are the most enormous forested regions on Earth. We know from analysis, that our fires in 1920 are globally unprecedented as mid-latitude forest fires over about the last 3 decades. There's been nothing like it. The colours on the map just represent the major fire runs and their relationship to the Forest Fire Danger Index. The sort of red tones represent the more extreme values of the FFDI up into the severe and extreme range. We can see different patterns. Stuff up north ran under, pretty high FFDIs. Remarkably, in the centre, Gosper's Mountain Fire and the Green Wattle complexes experienced much more moderate conditions in general. But they were unrelenting, and that sort of partly explains the enormous size of those fires. And then down south in the new year, in particular, we had some pretty extreme weather conditions associated with those fire runs. I talked about pyroconvective fires. This is actually called a pyrocumulonimbus. Recent analysis suggests that we had about 20 of those pyro-CB events in 2019-20, and that was more or less about 50% of what had occurred in the preceding decades. And we know the phenomenal power of those events. So something really extraordinary happened to produce that many of these firestorms. If you lived through the season, you know that there was all sorts of public debate and discussion about what happened and why it happened. There's some of the issues or questions that were debated in the media amongst colleagues and friends and all that sort of stuff in the community. Was it to do with climate change? Were fuel levels abnormal? Was there too much logging making forests more flammable, or too little logging? Logging could prevent or reduce the flammability of forests. Arson, there was debate about ignition sources and all that sort of thing. So I'm just going to quickly cover some of these issues for you. We're able to look now at historical trends in fuel across New South Wales. We have enough information to have a go at estimating what it is. We can use the fire history map and the fuel accumulation curves that are used in fire behaviour analysis by the Rural Fire Service to piece together a picture. And when we looked at average fuel levels going back to 1990, you can see the trends there for surface fuels, elevated fuels and bark fuels. You can see that generally they're flat. The lines just represent different regions in New South Wales. There's a dip after the 2002-3 season when about 1 million hectares burned in New South Wales. So obviously fuel levels went down as a consequence of those fires, and they recovered as they would. But there's nothing particularly abnormal. So fuel levels are pretty much the same at the beginning of the 2019 season as they were across the last 30 years, with the exception of the aftermath of 2002. So something else must have happened. The fuel levels were not anomalously high. We can always ponder what might have been if they'd been lower, but they weren't exceptionally high above the longer term average. So something else must have happened. Here's a map of estimated dead fuel moisture content in December 2019 when the fires were reaching their zenith. And simply we can see from the orange and red that we had either record levels of low fuel dryness or very much below average across many of the affected landscapes. We're able to produce these maps sequentially across the season. This graph is from a paper that we published last year where we looked at dead fuel moisture across past decades across the whole of southeastern Australia, and you can just simply see the trend. We are in a situation of critically dry fuel across an enormous area of southeastern Australia. In effect, all the forested landscapes were connected up with dry fuel. All the normally wet bits of the landscapes had started to disappear. This is just a map of the Forest Fire Danger Index and in relation to the historical records for December 2019, and we can see that the average Forest Fire Danger Index was at record levels. We'll conclude by saying the fires were an outcome of record dryness and chronic fire weather across much of southeastern Australia. We're able to, courtesy of the Rural Fire Service, as of the middle of last year, to obtain records, information from fire investigation about sources of ignition. And these graphs simply show the ignition causes. You can see lightning on both non-tow-ban and tow-ban days stands out quite markedly, though there are a lot of unknown, or there were a lot of undetermined or unknown sources of fire at that stage of the game. And you can see the area that could be attributed, or the area that was burned that could be attributed to those different sources. And we've actually taken this further and looked at the amount of house loss, and lightning determined area burned and house loss stands out as the predominant feature of the ignition breakdown. So lightning is was the major source of ignition, though there's a lot of unknown stuff, and determinant of impact. Fuel reduction and land management, such as forestry, different land tenures. It's worth saying the amount of national parks versus, say, state forests and crown land that burnt is roughly about the same, proportionally. And the amount of high severity fire is roughly about the same across land tenures. There's no outstanding thing that sticks out when you look at the relationships between the fires and tenure. We're in the fortunate position of having done some intensive risk estimation using Phoenix modelling in a range of landscapes across eastern New South Wales. That's just some of them. They're essentially large-scale case studies. And we're able to compare the amount of risk reduction to life and property under long-term weather conditions prior to 2019 and compare that with the actual weather conditions experienced in 2019. And that more or less told us that the effectiveness of the hazard reduction program in terms of risk to life and property was reduced by about 40 to 60% under the 2019-20 weather conditions, compared with a sort of long-term weather outcome. Those approaches it's worth saying that those modelling approaches are going to be applied in the new trials for risk management planning in northern Sydney. So it's sort of like an application of the same methodology that will be forthcoming. We've also looked at recently the relationship between logging and fire severity. Fire severity being the vertical profile of damage that you can estimate from satellites after fires. And we found that crown fire in forests was overwhelmingly related to high forest fire danger index. Logging only had very small effects, and they varied strongly between the South Coast, North Coast and East Gippsland. So contrary to what many people were saying, logging really doesn't have any major effect on, or didn't have any major effect on the outcome from what we can see at this stage. People and property. The different colours here just represent property loss, house loss. Obviously, red means more, green means low. This is in sort of 20-kilometre hexagons across the fire grounds. We can see hotspots of high property loss up north and also down south. And, you know, that obviously, if you followed what happened, the extraordinary fires on the south coast reflect those patterns of property loss. We're able to drill in, and I'll explain this graph, we're able to drill into these data and examine the relationship between FFDI on the bottom axis and the likelihood of house loss, and whether or not, the proportion of landscape within 1 kilometre of houses that had received hazard reduction in the last few years. We can see from this that the predominant influence on house loss was the weather, and that was via crown fire. So severe or extreme FFDI causes crown fires, which obviously, if they're adjacent to property within 1 kilometre, have a big influence on property loss. And fuel reduction within a kilometre, so up to half of the landscape within a kilometre, has some effect in mitigating losses, though that's actually less sensitive than the weather. So high forest fire danger index, increased house loss via adjacent crown fires. House loss is reduced by hazard reduction within 1 kilometre. Strong evidence of that, but the hazard reduction effect is smaller than the weather effect. We also found that there's strong evidence of effectiveness of suppression mixed in with this stuff. We were able to analyse census data across the firegrounds from the 2016 census. This is just an index of socio-economic disadvantage. The lighter colours represent more disadvantaged communities. You can see from up north that a lot of people that you might classify as highly disadvantaged under the census criteria were affected by the fires. Less so down south though, there are pockets of disadvantage. Similarly, we looked at a whole bunch of other indicators. One of them shows that a very high proportion of areas, that many areas containing a high proportion of Aboriginal people were severely affected by the fires. I'm not showing the results here, but almost perversely, in opposition to those trends, we found that the likelihood of house loss was actually higher in areas with high economic status. And we think that's being driven by some of the losses on the south coast, of property owned by people who are maybe wealthy retirees or etc. Okay, about 30% of rainforest in New South Wales was burnt. Here's an example of cool temperate rainforest up in the Northern Ranges. This is extremely concerning. We know that rainforest and alpine vegetation, this is just a graph that shows rainforest and alpine vegetation were strongly affected by high severity fires, intense fires. So this is going to have major consequences. We can analyse other trends such as these vulnerability analysis based on fire frequency that we use our ecological indicators of fire frequency. We know that the 2019 fires, as shown in this map, have resulted in a considerable proportion of eastern New South Wales now being classified into a state that is potentially vulnerable. So we could be looking at losses of species should further fires occur. Here's a shot up near Nunes in the Blue Mountains a year after the Gospers Mountain fire. We can see erosion, massive erosion on the hill slope, and we can see that regrowth here is very, very slow. It was not only the intensity of the fire, it's also partly an outcome of the drought. So we can find areas like this around the state in forests where things, the resilience has been retarded, probably by the synergistic effect of the fires and the drought. So many ecosystems and species have been left in a highly vulnerable state. Recovery is variable. It's got something to do with the drought, even though we've had heavy rain since the fires, everyone's aware of that. We also had significant water quality problems, both in reservoirs, rivers, lakes, and there's been documented examples of fish kills and really deleterious effects on aquatic fauna, etc. One of the big issues was smoke, and there's been some analysis already published which says maybe 400 premature deaths across South Australia due to the massive smoke pollution, chronic and prolonged smoke exposure, particularly of urban populations who weren't necessarily on the front line of the fires. So places like Canberra were smoked out for literally a month. When you think about it, these potential effects of smoke actually outweigh, the indirect effects outweigh the direct losses, as tragic as those were. 400 versus 30 odd across southeastern Australia in terms of the death toll. It's estimated that the health costs of the smoke exceed $2 billion, which is about nearly an order of magnitude more than previous seasons, major seasons. But there were successes. There's a lot of new information that's incredibly valuable, and there are even surprises that come out of the fire. The effort that went into protecting the Wollongong pine populations has been well publicised. There was active intervention, a sprinkler system set up, tremendous effort went in to protect the groves from the Gospers Mountain fire. Here is a Wollongong pine that is planted on someone's property, which was fully scorched, but it's actually resprouting. We didn't know that before. So they have some capacity to withstand even total scorch. Amazing. Probably explains why they're still around. Here is the Mount Solitary prescribed burn, hazard reduction burn done in 2018. It's sort of become an iconic example of prescribed burning. This is part of a treatment program in the Blue Mountains, since 2016. This fire and a number of others that were done since 2016, for risk mitigation purposes, they cause significant smoke problems in Sydney. But I can tell you, as a resident of the Upper Blue Mountains, these treatment programs saved hundreds of properties. So the smoke that was inflicted on Sydney during these fuel reduction operations, despite all the drama and everything, was probably worth it. The losses that accrued from these operations are more than made up for by the success of these hazard reduction programs in that particular region. And we need to be mindful of that. That's the ruined castle fire spreading into that treated area. Recent study, which has only just come out, it's worth having a look at, which is a survey of residents in affected communities, has shown that there was really a high level of uptake of information. People were using the apps, they wanted more information, they used the information in terms of their preparation and their own decision making in affected communities. In fact, things like fires near me are almost, in my opinion, a victim of their own success. People, once they've got them, they want more and more and more. There are also important opportunities to learn more. Aircraft, particularly large air tankers, were deployed extensively throughout the season. We know very little about, beyond anecdotes, about what they achieved, and that needs to be really thoroughly examined, particularly the use of retardant. We know that backburning or containment burning during the operations is very controversial. Here's a photo I took on the 14th of December when the containment burn up along the Mount Wilson Road went pear-shaped. Some of those containment burning operations were highly successful, others failed. This was a notable failure. We need to figure out why. It's not to blame anyone, we just need to analyse why we had successes and why we had failures, and to build a better operational knowledge. We need to figure out how the drought on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side in Europe, how drought preconditions vegetation to burn. It adds to the fuel load, etc. Makes the stuff more flammable. We don't understand this very well, and we don't include it in our modelling of fire behaviour at the moment. We've got a golden opportunity to figure out how our development standards performed. A lot of property built to current standards was exposed, and we need to pull that apart and figure out how well the standards worked. We don't really know at this stage. We've seen phenomenal resources devoted to recovery, various packages for affected communities, for recovery of threatened species, mental health, finally recognised really as a critical issue. And the whole business of insurance, people being caught, underinsured, etc., having to rebuild to higher standards has been part of that journey of recovery. It's not an easy journey for many people. Despite all the unprecedented expenditure and effort, people, communities and environments may have been permanently changed. We have to understand that. I'll have more to say about that in a minute. I've just tried to summarise all the points there. I won't go through them in detail, other than to emphasise the first point. The fires were climatically driven. They are a climatic phenomenon. There's no escaping this. And I've listed some of the successes and failures and interesting things highlighted there. So, we've now reached the point. It's in the sort of scientific and social science literature, there's a lot of discussion about the disaster inquiry cycle. We're all familiar with this. We have major fire seasons, there's inquiries. It goes round and round and round. Recommendations are made. Changes may or may not implement those recommendations. So we've reached that interesting point in the aftermath. We've had a Royal Commission, a National Royal Commission. We've had a very comprehensive state inquiry. There's other inquiries, which if you're an enthusiast of reading this stuff, two really important ones in Victoria. The Victorian Auditor General was doing a big project which started in mid-2019 on their bushfire risk capacity, and fortuitously the fire season occurred right in the middle of that review. Their report is actually very interesting to have a look at. Okay, so, you know, here's a few highlights. Sorry if I've left out your favourite highlight, but these are ones that are resonant with some of the points that I've tried to make. We've got a new national agency that's supposedly been created to handle disasters and recovery. Of course, we had Resilience New South Wales set up, which is a tremendous initiative. We've got more people, equipment, aircraft, all those sort of things are coming on stream. Really valuable and very much appreciated. If you look through the inquiries, there's an emphasis on strategic risk reduction as a direction for the future. Lots of stuff on technological innovation and communications, fire trail standards, all that sort of stuff. Mental health, emphasised as a major issue in the inquiries, and it really is great to see that there. And the whole issue of smoke and health, which is an emerging issue in the medical literature, is now fully been brought into the spotlight as something that we really have to confront. All inquiries emphasise that climate change is happening. Climate change was a factor in these climatically driven fires, and that we now have to prepare for a future under climate change. But will this be enough? These are the trends in the Forest Fire Danger Index over the last few decades. The KBDI, which is the traditional measure of drought and fuel dryness that goes into the Fire Danger Index. And the lower graph is vapour pressure deficit, which is the atmospheric dryness. Now vapour pressure deficit is being seen as the most incisive measure of fuel dryness that we can, which is very easy to formulate and to predict and to estimate across entire landscapes. They're all going up, and what we saw was the clashing of the symbols in 2019. There's a huge literature on predicting these things into the future from climatic models, etc. And it doesn't look good if you take that literature as a whole. So what does the future hold for fire in our part of the world? Well, This graph, which I will take a moment to explain, is absolutely terrifying. Because this came out early on after the fires, and it's a modelling exercise which is a representation, the traces in the lines represent the trends in fire as produced by what are called Earth system models, which couple the atmosphere and the Earth and the vegetation. Yeah, and they encompass many of the feedback processes that are involved in mediating the atmosphere and the climate and responses of vegetation. And Earth system models can deal with fire. So this particular group have applied Earth system models to climate change projections. They've projected them backwards, back to 1950, and forwards into the late 21st century. And the different coloured lines just represent different emission scenarios and stuff for this part of the world. The black line represents reality. And look at 2019. So you can see the general trend going up across the back end of the 21st century, but 2019 is so far above the projections on the climate change, it is truly terrifying. So what we saw in 2019 is beyond future projections. Possibly the models are wrong. They're just underestimating the severity of the situation. A lot of people say to me, what does it represent? Well, I think it represents a new upper extreme. Previously, if we had a 1 million hectare season in New South Wales, that was, there's been a couple of those in the last 200 years, but now we had a beyond 5 million hectare season. So it's the new upper extreme. So if that were to occur again, what are we going to do? In terms of operational capacity, the disaster inquiry cycle has yielded an incremental change in capacity. We've got more trucks, aircraft, people, better fire trails, coming on stream. It's a percentage change on the status quo. But 2019 was transformative. It's an order of magnitude in terms of its size and impact and everything. It's diagnostics on the immediate past. So we have to ask whether, say, our operational capacity in toto that has emerged, the changes that have emerged, will be enough to cope with a repeat in the near future. It's a pretty ugly question. It's not to say that all those changes aren't welcome. They are, but will they be enough? So, the future. Peaceful coexistence or mutually assured destruction. Well, I grew up, as a schoolboy in the 1960s, so I was fascinated by the Cold War. Peaceful coexistence as a term was invented by Nikita Khrushchev. So, he was the successor of Stalin as the supremo of the Soviet Union. So I hope we can peacefully coexist. That's what we've got to aspire to. So I will finish by talking about 5 R's, which might help us to find a way that we can peacefully coexist because, we need to do more. And in particular, I want to highlight vulnerability in wrapping up. Vulnerability is one of the determinants of risk, the vulnerability of our people and our communities and our ecosystems. Okay, so resilience. Resilience means bouncing back, as we've heard, but we simply cannot build back to where we were before. And in other words, some of the changes that are already hard baked into our recovery will not bring us back to where we were before. Many destroyed properties will be built back to a higher standard. Resilience needs to be adaptive, which means simply that we'll bounce back, but we'll bounce back to a different level than we were before. We have to understand that and maybe embrace that. We have a huge challenge in retrofitting and re-engineering existing developments which are highly vulnerable. Resilience of ecosystems, well, I talked about Wollongong pines. We've probably got to stop imagining that we can just let things tick along. Got to actively intervene, transplant species, re-engineer, breeding, all sorts of stuff. Can't just let it all go. Drought, it's not just fire. Fire and drought are intertwined, and understanding drought as the sort of hammer of climate change and fire in the future is going to be critical in terms of our environments and how we make a living out of them. A lot of people say, oh, we just should retreat, give up. Shouldn't allow people to rebuild, etc. It's probably not realistic, nor is it desirable. We can't just all go and live in apartments in Bondi. It's important that people do live in landscapes. There's someone who gave up. The real estate ad didn't mention that the property had burnt down. But we can consider retreat at another scale. We've got to separate developments better from flammable bushland. A lot of our interface is in a terrible state and is unsustainable. It makes property highly vulnerable. That doesn't mean just laying waste to it. We can be creative, we can intervene, we can re-engineer, etc., and make it pleasant and amenable, but lower the vulnerability. This isn't a photo in Australia, it's from California from 2017, Santa Rosa fire, where 5,000 houses were destroyed in central California, whole suburbs. It looks like Hiroshima. Why? Because developments look like this. We are building stuff like this around our major cities, which is just setting up the problem for house-to-house propagation. So somehow or other our standards are not coping well because we're seeing this stuff, which will eventually be affected by fire. Smart separation rather than retreat to reduce vulnerability. We're entering into a new era of risk management, risk estimation, which I've hinted at. For the bushfire districts and the risk management plans, there are new trials occurring which will employ new simulation technology to understand options for treatment. Here's just an example from Phoenix simulation that's about to be applied to some case studies in northern Sydney. New technology for looking at vulnerability in fuels from airborne LiDAR. But we need more focused risk assessment down at the individual property level to inform people. It needs to be multi-scale. And I'll tell you what, insurance is now emerging. Insurance companies are looking at the problem of risk, and it's going to change the premium structures. So we're going to have to get up to speed. Responsibility, vulnerability and risk. Individuals have a high degree of ownership in their own backyard. They need to be given the information so that they can answer this question: to what degree can I mitigate my risk and how much will it cost? We can do better. Avoid myopia in order to live with fire. Personal responsibility and choice is a catalyst for coexistence. Renewal. We now are in like an emergency services management paradigm. We have big aircraft, lots of machines, technology, etc., and that requires a centralised command and control structure. Once upon a time, the volunteer system was self-organising. It was about people getting together and protecting their own communities. Centralisation versus local knowledge comes up all the time as an issue. It's a serious issue. Obviously, the Rural Fire Service has got many great initiatives in terms of information, education, etc. But can we renew the ethos of community spirit and re-empower it, resource it, not in a way that's in competition, but in a way that can augment our emergency services, the edifice. Let's renew and resource the ethos of self-organisation and community self-protection. There are huge challenges. We've got ageing rural populations, tree changes, all that sort of stuff going on. So we have to overcome that. We might ask for a more detailed social licence to operate in return. Finally, renewal equals reconciliation and reconnection. Aboriginal people want to be involved. Cultural fire management is a exciting and important thing that is reawakening. It's a way for Aboriginal people to re-establish their identity. So we must make the space for them and perhaps resource these initiatives. But we also must respect the intellectual property of Aboriginal people. It is something, it is an agenda that they own and they will set the pace. I'm a non-Aboriginal person. I cannot appropriate that knowledge. I can learn from it, and if I'm lucky, Aboriginal people will share it with me. But we always must remember that it is their game. So how can we, as a society, foster that? Because the benefits from it are huge, particularly in terms of just the well-being and the reconnection of some of the most disadvantaged people in our society. So it's a reinvigoration, a reawakening. So I'd just like to end by acknowledging that. That's my acknowledgement of country. That's an exciting possibility for the future. Thank you.